All right, welcome back. This is part 2 of session 2. So far this morning, we finished up our discussion of the business analysis, planning, and monitoring tasks, and then we went into the different elicitation techniques. There was a lot of discussion around some of the techniques, for example, workshops. So I just wanted to go back into the BABOK on workshops. Remember that all the techniques are covered in Chapter 10. They're all listed alphabetically. So from 10.1 to 10.50 something, or is this the last one? Anyway, you'll find them there. One thing about workshops, and as you get deeper into reading BABOK, you'll see things in much more detail. For example, they will generally include, and these are true of most any kind of workshop, the goal, collaborative work, a defined work product, a facilitator, etc. You'll see that workshops can promote trust, mutual understanding. Keep track of these kinds of words. These are important things that you need to remember with regard to a particular technique. Look also at the elements, for more detail. So this is what a business analyst would do in terms of preparing for a workshop. We said that prepare, conduct, check, improve, these are things that we do regardless of the technique. They underlie all techniques. Well, here's what preparation looks like for a workshop. Things like identifying who is the facilitator and who is the scribe. Who should participate? Who should not participate? Right? What is the agenda? All of these things are important. We talked about some of the roles, and here you see author is not a role, sponsor is a role. Right? To what degree is a sponsor involved in a workshop? And you see it says things like the sponsor could be a participant, right? But does not have to have ultimate accountability for the workshop's outcome, meaning that the workshop might make decisions different from the sponsor. I'm sorry, does have, not does not have, does have accountability for the outcome. Right? So if whether or not the sponsor participates, the sponsor is basically accountable overall, for things that are going on, right? And so whatever we do in a workshop should be consistent with what the sponsor goals are. Or if we discover something that's different, we have to go back to the sponsor and perhaps explain what we learned in that workshop that might require the sponsor's attention. So these are the nuances I'm asking you to keep track of. Again, the scribe is defined in some degree of detail. Notice there's another role called a timekeeper. You'll find that across many different techniques. That could be the facilitator. It could be somebody different from the facilitator, depending on what you're trying to do and who's best able to do that. Right? So look at all of these levels of detail for each particular technique. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out, I mentioned it yesterday, is Appendix B. And you'll see in Appendix B for each technique, and again they're shown, it's in order, each technique is shown in order. And then for that technique, what are the different knowledge areas where you'll find reference to that technique? And so let's look at one that we've already covered. Brainstorming. Brainstorming appears in business analysis, planning, and monitoring. And it appears in every task as part of business analysis, planning, and monitoring. Does that mean I'm going to do brainstorming every time I want to consider an approach? I'm going to do brainstorming every time I consider stakeholder engagement, I'm going to do brainstorming every time I talk about governance. Well, some of these make more sense than others, but it's possible, and therefore it's listed as a potential technique in that particular task. It's also listed in 2 of the tasks for elicitation. It's not listed for any of the tasks in requirements lifecycle management, etc. And so for each technique, you find where it is referenced, and as a review element, this appendix helps you go back and understand, so why is brainstorming listed here? What makes it a particular strength, or what does it add to this kind of a technique, to this kind of a task? What are some limitations? Why would I use this technique over some other technique? This is a good way to review all the techniques and become, again, more familiar with which ones apply to which tasks. Remember that a technique helps you perform a task. The technique helps you come up with what that task is trying to produce, with some outcome. The other thing I wanted to highlight again was the mind map that we introduced yesterday regarding just the techniques. So I caution that because a particular technique is shown here in just one place does not mean that that's the only place that technique will appear. Right? So we just saw from the appendix how a technique can be in many different tasks, many different knowledge areas. But we look at the technique as a part of this development of our certification prep as a way to illustrate what goes on in that knowledge area. It makes understanding that knowledge area a little bit easier if you can get a feel for what's happening in that knowledge area. Why would I use different techniques as a part of different tasks? And so as we go through each new set of techniques, come back to this mind map and get a feel again for why it might appear here, why we're using it to illustrate this particular knowledge area.
So question on that box under illustration, Peter. The collaboration is the knowledge area, and the techniques suitable to collaboration or would be the ones underneath it, vice versa, the research experiments?
Not quite. Elicitation is the knowledge area. Right? Now, there are different tasks involved in elicitation. The tasks are prepare, conduct, confirm. We're going to talk about these next. Communicate, and manage collaboration. But there are all the different techniques that I can use, all of the different types of elicitation activities that I might engage in fall within these 3 categories. Okay, so you'll notice in the elements associated with this chapter of elicitation how some of the techniques are considered to be collaborative, some of the techniques are considered to be research, some of the techniques are considered to be experiment.
Right. So those are categories, I guess, collaboration.
Within, yeah, categories of different elicitation techniques.
Yeah. Okay,
exactly.
Thanks.
Okay. Good. So let's talk about then the tasks more specifically related to elicitation. First, very quickly, what is elicitation different from gathering? We often hear about gathering requirements. We don't as often hear about eliciting requirements. What makes elicitation special?
It requires more research, like focus group and interviews.
It might.
More in-depth research, yeah.
All right, that's possible. What else?
With elicitation, it goes like deeper into detail.
It could. Research doesn't, but some could.
Maybe with elicitation, you're asking questions, gathering, maybe you're just getting documentation.
All right. Well, I can just gather information by asking questions too, but you're now getting into the right direction, right?
Collaborate.
I was gonna say elicitation is your input and your output of the requirement gathering. So requirement gathering is an output, a result of elicitation.
I wanted to say elicitation is a process, right, where input and output are all a part of it. But what makes elicitation different from gathering? I mean, gathering is like, walking down, walking through your living room and picking up your child's toys, right? That's gathering. Understanding what your kid wants to play with today and what might be a good indoor activity because it's raining outside or outdoor activity because spring is here, that's more elicitation. In other words, there's some interaction, back and forth, push and pull, challenging, confirming. Elicitation is a much more in-depth, rounded, complete approach to information. It's not just taking notes. Right? And so it's important to understand how elicitation is very interactive in that sense. Okay? So why do we do elicitation? It's so we can understand that the requirements that we do come up with, the requirements that we, and I'm going to say determine, not just gather, because everything we hear that somebody says is a requirement may not wind up being a requirement, but all the requirements that we eventually determine are greater opportunity that they're complete, greater opportunity that they are accurate, that they are consistent, they meet all of these different other requirements, that we have 4 requirements, okay? And so the way we do that is through elicitation. Someone tells me something they need, and I ask, well, why do you need that? What will you do with that? What if you don't get that? What happens after you do that? What other things do you gather in association with that? What things are valid inputs or not valid inputs? How do you rank these things? I'm asking all kinds of questions that leads me to a much deeper understanding of the information that we are eventually receiving or doing something with, okay? And so collaboration also has a special meaning. It's not just working with an individual, but it's how we work, whether it's with an individual or with a group, right? It's the relationship, it's the willingness to engage, it's the level of participation that we get. Right? I could be asking you a lot of questions and you could be sitting there just waiting for me to be finished so you can go on and do the next thing you have to do. Can't wait for this interview to be done. Right? That's not a high degree of collaboration. I could be interviewing you and you have no interest in this project. In fact, you wish it would go away. Your attitude about this is not going to be very conducive to good collaboration. Right? So you could be involved in a meeting and you could be having some ongoing dispute with what's being said. That's not going to be conducive to collaboration. Right? And so collaboration is this element of engagement, participation, to be productive. These are very important as we consider different elicitation techniques and the ways in which we can perform elicitation. So collaboration we define as the ability to work together and not just be in the same room, but actually know that we're here, we're trying to accomplish the same goal, we're trying to work, for a common cause, and so therefore we're more engaged and more cooperative. This is not a phase of stuff we do. We don't elicit and then put that away and now do other things in doing business analysis. It's ongoing. If I'm doing modeling in a workshop, in order to understand a process flow, am I eliciting? Anybody?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So, eliciting is something that it goes on and on throughout the whole business analysis process, the requirements life cycle. Right? So again, we go through these basic steps, preparing to do it, and pick any one activity. I'm going to prepare to do that activity. I'm going to conduct that activity. I'm going to confirm the results from that activity. I'm going to communicate what I learned from that or maybe multiple activities. Right? And I'm going to manage the kinds of collaboration that I am able to work with in doing that activity. So keep track of these different terms. They'll come up in terms of what is an elicitation activity, who is a subject matter expert, right? How do we understand things like potential value? In other words, here's something somebody requires, would like to do, and here's why they would like to do it, what it gives them. Keep track of the different supporting materials that might be relevant to different kinds of activities. Know that results can fall into these two categories, unconfirmed and confirmed. After we do an interview, the information that we just captured, we would consider to be unconfirmed results, even though I asked you, is that what you said? And you said, yeah, that's what I said. That's not the same as confirming those results. Confirming them now means that what I got from this interview is consistent with some other elicitation activity, something I read or something I heard from a meeting or something from a survey, right? And so I can confirm that it's accurate and it's complete beyond just nodding that, yeah, you captured what I said. And then in terms of communicating what we have, most often they're not communicating requirements, we have what we call a business analysis package. In other words, some format, some template, some deliverable, whether it's a BRD or an SRS or a vision statement or a business case or a test plan, right? All of that gets put into some type of a business analysis package as a formalized way of doing that communication. All right? So let's look at the individual tasks. And we can go through these, I hope, somewhat quickly because they're all very straightforward. Preparing. The more preparation we do, the better prepared we are, the higher the likelihood that we're going to get the results that are effective. Right? And so there's always a balance. I mean, I guess you can be overly prepared, but we rarely have to worry about that. More often than not, we want to understand what it is I need to get from this activity, therefore, how do I prepare for that activity? Right? So what's the scope of information I need? If I'm conducting an interview, what do I want that interview to cover? What are the different topics? How much breadth? How much depth? Okay. What is the best technique to use to get the information I'm looking for? Where do I go to do this? What technologies might I use? Do I depend on a conference call, or can I use a smartboard? Right? Or can we go off-site someplace? Hopefully someplace warm and comfortable, like the West Indies. Not in hurricane season. What kind of supporting materials do we need? Is there something that someone is supposed to have prepared for this particular session that we can share, that everyone has read or everyone has available? Right? And how much do all of our stakeholders understand about what it is we're going to be doing? If I'm conducting a focus group, do they understand the basic idea behind a focus group and how to work in a focus group? Here are some other elements that I will then explore for preparing for elicitation. What is the area of business I'm looking at? What kind of culture is there? Where are people located? What kind of skills do I have or other BAs have that will be required for this particular activity? What are the expected outputs? Who needs to be involved? What other activities might relate to this, either concurrently or before or after? What is the overall strategy for change that I'm coming up with? How does this fit within that strategy? What does the future solution look like if I know it at this point in time? And what are all the other sources of business analysis information that I might consider? And so all of this, any of this, can go into preparation. Different techniques require different amounts of time, different degrees of cost, different degrees of maybe professionalism. You know, how you do a survey, whether it's something like sending out a quick email or going to SurveyMonkey or using SurveyMonkey Pro. Whether it's a mass, I need input from 1,000 people, or whether it's just a handful. All these things have impacts that I want to consider. Okay? Logistics, location is one of the obvious ones. Like, think of doing an interview. Do I interview you in your office, or do I interview you in my office, or do we go to a conference room? Do we need a whiteboard available? Right? Do we go to a cafeteria, or do something on a lunch break, or some other scenario? Can I get information walking down the hall with somebody? The answer to that, by the way, is yes. Is it sufficient for what I'm trying to learn? Well, maybe or maybe not. So think about all of the logistics issues and the supporting information. Do we need to use a smartboard, where I can actually pull up files from the internet, or pull up documents, or share documents in concurrent time? Is that going to be better than a web conference? Is that going to be better than some type of a video conference? Making sure everybody comes to the session prepared to participate is a big advantage to seeing that we don't run into problems during whatever that particular activity is. So I think you can see how preparing is an important contributor to success. If we now go to conducting, so we're actually going to do the activity at this point. Right? Well, this is where the exchange in information is occurring, in the conducting of that activity. Right? I have an agenda. I need to follow my agenda. I started out exploring a certain topic. I need to know how far to let that discussion run and when to pull it back. I need to know, if I get this information, how do I know that that information is complete, that it's everything I need to understand? When do I drill down into greater level of detail? When do I not drill down because it's not important for what I'm trying to learn? All of these things go into doing the elicitation activity. Here are the three different types that we talked about: research, collaboration, and experimentation. And the kinds of things that I would do in each one, whether it's something like document analysis, or whether there's interviews or group meetings, or whether it's doing prototyping. I've captured this page out of the BABOK. This is the input-output diagram for conducting elicitation. Notice that the output is used for the other task, or within this same knowledge area, confirm elicitation results. Remember that unconfirmed results are the immediate output of an elicitation activity. Confirmed results come from my ability to now compare that with other things, to see that it's consistent and accurate, etc.
Peter, how
Yes.
do we confirm the results?
Okay, so if I interview you and you give me an understanding of what you think a process is, might I go to someone else and ask them their ideas about that process?
Okay.
Right? And those ideas might be consistent, they might be different. Okay, and so if they're different, well, now what do I do? Well, one of them might be accurate, one might be not accurate. Maybe I've uncovered some nuances. Maybe that's going to lead me to do something else, like do an observation. All right, so
Okay.
I haven't confirmed the results until I've had a chance to understand that what I am getting from that particular activity is in fact complete, accurate, comprehensive, etc. So that's why
Okay.
confirming is set out as a separate task. Right?
Okay. So there are techniques to confirm as well, different techniques.
We'll cover that in just a second.
Okay.
Comparing two interviews is not necessarily a different technique. It's just looking at the unconfirmed results from one interview and the unconfirmed results from another interview and realizing that I had two different stories.
Right.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I do with that might lead to another elicitation activity like an observation.
Okay. I got it. I think I got it.
All right? And maybe only with the observation can I then confirm the real results, the actual results.
Okay. Thank you.
Good. All right. So, and again, conducting elicitation, I want to make sure that I am achieving what the goals were, that I stay as much as I can within the scope of what it is I want to do, right? But I'm prepared to explore other things that were not anticipated, if that's appropriate, right? I might look for other steps to follow this step as a part of that activity. Right? So I remain focused. That's a key element. That doesn't mean excluding all other things, but knowing when other things might be relevant or not relevant. And then we talked already about how to capture information. And we think of that in terms of a scribe. If I'm doing an interview, I might capture the information myself. I might have somebody else writing down the results of the conversation that are going on. I might have a recording device of one kind or another. Might have some other ways, like on a whiteboard or whatever, and then take a picture of it with my smartphone. There's any number of different ways to capture information depending on the activity that I'm doing.
Peter, you said like if you had two interviews and one you got different like answers from each interview, how would you confirm those results? Would you do a third interview with someone else, or how would you confirm?
What a great question. Why don't we talk about the next task, which is confirm elicitation results. All right? You don't mind if I use your question as the opening for the next one?
Please do.
Good. So I think the question why is obvious, because what we got from one interview may or may not be accurate. Right? Now, it might be not accurate or complete because of omission, or maybe commission. Somebody misled me for one reason or another. Right? Or maybe there are two legitimately different views. Maybe somebody's looking at what should happen and somebody's looking at, well, within reality, what does happen. Right? And so how do I resolve that? Well, my goal in confirming is to look for things that may or may not be consistent, may or may not be complete, may or may not be accurate. Right? And then if I've discovered something that might be missing or might be conflicting or might be an error, then I can determine what to do with it. So in the case of two interviews, well, what am I trying to learn? Am I learning about a process? Observation might be a perfect follow-up activity. If I'm doing an interview and somebody mentions a document, well, one question I like to ask in the interview is, could I have access to that document? You know, whether it's hard copy or electronic or whatever. Is it confidential? There's a lot of other things I want to learn about that document. But now I might go in and do document analysis, and maybe that helps me complete things that were missing in the interview. Maybe it contradicts things that were in the interview. Maybe I need to do further confirmation, right, in order to make sure that what I have is ultimately accurate and complete. So I want to consider the sources of information as well as other sources of information that I might use. Comparing results is, I think, an easy way to do confirmation. So looking at what I got out of different activities, that's a good starting point, right? And where I see things that might be missing or inconsistent, then figure out what the next step is. Quite often, you know, what we get from one activity is an indicator of further information I need to gather. I can't get it from this source. I need to do something else now to get more detail. All right? And so
I have
one
a question
thing
on that.
could lead to another. Go ahead.
Follow up with stakeholder. This is Mohammed.
Yep.
Follow up with the stakeholders to correct information. You mentioned that during the confirmation stage, it turned out that, you know, everything was heading one way, and all of a sudden that it's going to complete a different direction. After you confirmed with an old document or an old process, realized that we're doing things like like we're not supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that can have a huge effect on the values that you defined earlier on during the planning stages, right? And the needs and the change and whatnot. You know, how do you face that challenge?
So here's two different scenarios, right? On the one hand, Mohammed, since you and I spoke last time, I talked with Shelley, and Shelley gave me an entirely different story. And I really don't believe what you're giving me. So, you know, what's the problem here? What are you withholding from me? Why aren't you telling me the truth?
Yeah.
If I approached you that way, am I going to be building a relationship?
Not really.
No. I'm going to set myself up for a royal battle.
You'll get a decline.
On the other hand, you know, the last time we spoke, Mohammed, I was able to get another idea from Shelley. Now, maybe she's looking at the process from a different perspective, or maybe she's getting something else from it. But here are two different ideas, and help me understand, you know, why both ideas are coming about. You know, is there some reason why one might prevail, or are we seeking some new information that we weren't familiar with? I can ask all kinds of questions in ways that will elicit better understanding and build a relationship. I mean, you would probably get to the point that, boy, am I glad you checked with Shelley, because, you know, she brought out something that I forgot to mention.
But no, I understand that. That's my question is more around, you know, if you come to that confirmation and you realize the correct answer is steering away the business values and the change and the main reason for the change. You know, what do you do as a BA at that point? You go back to the stakeholders and remap everything from the start again?
Well,
because the value is no longer there if we just follow the old process as an example that you just discovered, right?
Yeah, I may or may not need to go back and redo something. Maybe I just go forward. Maybe I communicate, you know, a set of requirements that might have been different than what we started out with. Maybe I explain that. I mean, whatever I do, and I do it in a way that everybody understands what's going on. I can see your question in 100 different contexts, right? And so I would handle it depending on the context.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks.
You know, if we started out changing a process And then later on we discovered that the process was not worth changing. In fact, we shouldn't even worry about it. We should just automate it or, avoid it or do something entirely different. At some point I'm going to let people know that the scope of this project has now changed from this modification to, this reinvention or reimagining. If it's important for me to communicate that, which is going to be the next task, right? So maybe what you're asking really gets to the next task, then that's how I follow up. Right? That's the consequence. So again, in confirming, we start with some way to just compare things that we've already learned, or we even look for other things to compare, right? In order to, again, have the confidence that whatever it is we are getting is basically in a complete and accurate mode. And then, what do we communicate? Right? So, here's another example of communication. If I'm doing a survey, do I have to let everybody who participated in the survey know what the results of the survey were?
Yes, I don't think you do.
No, you don't. Right. I may or may not want to do that. It may or may not be important for people to know that. A lot of times I can do an elicitation activity and I make it clear that the results from this activity are going to be used as input, not necessarily definitive in terms of requirements. Okay, so I can do surveys, I can do focus groups, I can do all kinds of things, and the input is valuable, but that doesn't mean we voted and we decided, necessarily. All right, so again, what people's expectations were coming into that activity, and what do I do after that activity, in particular in the ways that we communicate. All right, so how we communicate quite often is dictated by certain deliverables, whether they're milestones that we have as business analysts, in terms of a requirements document or a status review or whatever else. Different ways of communicating have different levels of formality, different stakeholder audiences, different ways of portraying that information. So I can do an oral presentation, I can do a written report, I can do an email, any number of different things. We often see this role of business analysis as being a bridge between the business community and the developer community, or those who have the problem and those who can solve the problem. And so there's a lot of communication back and forth that we do. Right? And so we understand different audiences have different levels of domain knowledge or technical expertise or regulatory concern or, high level, low level. Right? And so we target all of our communication efforts to meet that need for that audience at that point in time. Okay, so when do we do things like develop a business case for a project? That's a question.
At what point in the what part of the project? At the beginning?
Yeah, at the beginning, right. When do we know the least about the project?
At the beginning?
At the beginning, right. What does that tell us about our business case?
Well, we got to talk to the stakeholders.
Maybe we want to keep some of these things open, and so as we understand our projected costs and projected benefits, maybe we revisit this from time to time. Maybe the business case is something we want to update from time to time. It's not just done at the beginning. Maybe managing to the business case is not going to be the correct way to go. So there's an example of something that we communicate, and maybe we communicate it again at a different point in time with a greater understanding maybe to the point we actually have to go back and, I forget, Muhammad, I think, was saying, well, what if we learn that the path we started out with is the wrong path? Well, now you got an issue. Maybe the business case will help support that. That, in fact, happened to me on a very visible, expensive, big project, which I don't have time to go into. But absolutely use the business case to say why the approach that was being developed was the wrong approach to use and needed to be totally revamped.
Question, Pete. You said back a previous, like one slide, I think one slide maybe prior, you were saying about that. You referred to like the business, the BA being the middle person between the business community and the IT community. You said like the IT, I guess the IT community, the individual solving the problem. How did you refer to the business community?
Those who have the problem.
Those who have the problem. Okay, thank you.
When I think of stakeholders, I think of stakeholders, those who have a problem to solve and those who can solve the problem. And it's not just IT. Some things are solved by finding a different supplier or changing a process or, something of that nature, right? Not everything is an IT problem, but more often than not we deal with IT problems. But anyway, the basic concept is that we work with those who have a problem to solve and those who can help solve the problem. Go back to that definition of business analysis. We enable change by understanding needs, from different stakeholders within the context of an enterprise, so we can recommend the right solutions that add value. All right. Anyway, we're communicating information. So we communicate at many points with different audiences, different things that we want to get across. And so we have to understand each time that format, that purpose, to see that that communication is effective. Our communications need to be clear, need to be concise, need to accomplish whatever purpose it is that communication needs to accomplish. So if we're doing things like delivering a BRD, usually it represents a handoff. Say, here you are, here are the requirements that we have in a waterfall type environment. Right? And so you get people to accept that handoff, they've clarified what they need to know, and now we have a baseline going forward. Anything beyond that, we communicate as a change to the requirements. And that might also require a formal type of review with different inputs and things that are conveyed. Some things that we do are required legally. Some things we do are required because of convention or process or procedure that we've established. Okay? And keep in mind that if I'm talking about Agile, there are different types of documents, different ways of communicating, different points in time that all these things are governed by. But when we talk about a package, usually it's in a waterfall environment, usually it's something written out, usually it's something like a BRD that has a template. It could be, in the case of Agile, something like a user story. And we can keep breaking down user stories into smaller and smaller stories. Right? And how we define that format, again, is something we follow. Right? So all of these are representative of different ways of communicating in the context of a communication package. Where do we do all the planning for this? In business analysis, planning, and monitoring. Planning communications, planning information management. Right? That's where we address some of these issues.
Peter, I had a question. In some companies, I think we talked about this in the previous slide, there is already standards and templates to use to communicate different milestones of the project or different stages or phases throughout the change. But in most traditional companies, and we are one of them, is we use emails to these communications and obviously meetings and whatnot. But is there any templates that Adaptive would recommend or suggest for us to use as communication tools?
Adaptive has not gone that far as to recommend particular templates, and there are so many. I don't know that would necessarily be productive. So I would go to other sources for those if you were looking for templates. By the way, if you're relying on email, I would be very cautious, because email, as much as we spend a half hour writing the perfect email, somebody always interprets it the wrong way.
Yeah, I understand. It is a challenge, yeah.
Just to give you a quick anecdote, what's a short period of time you can think of? What's a short period of time?
Oh, sorry? What's a short period of time?
Yeah.
We go as 1 second or 1 minute.
Okay. Is there something shorter than that?
Milliseconds, nanoseconds.
Oh, nanoseconds. Something shorter than that.
I would have to look it up on Google.
Let me give you a suggestion. There's something called an onosecond.
Oh, wow.
It's the time it takes when you hit send on an email to say, oh no.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, that's my cautionary note on using email. Using email is unstructured, and people do it for all kinds of different reasons, and so just be very, very, very careful. Now, on the other hand, you can have over-reliance on documentation that's a lot of writing exercise that doesn't add a lot of value. Right? So the trick here is to find the right amount of writing in the right format that conveys what you need to convey. You don't want to write too much. You don't want to write too little. Okay? Again, we communicate in different ways, either to a group, involving a group, individually, email, presentations, all kinds of different things. Right? So that's communication, and there's one more task to deal with in this module, and that's managing stakeholder collaboration. Remember that collaboration is how we not only engage, but engage in an effective way so that people are participating and contributing and working with each other so that the results are more effective, right? And sometimes when you have something as simple as conflict between people or resistance that somebody might be showing, that just doing a little bit of attention towards collaboration will help us resolve that. Just paying attention to somebody's ideas, paraphrasing somebody's ideas, having people appreciate what other persons have recommended. There are all different ways that we can get over those kinds of surface issues, and again come back to what is the main purpose we are trying to solve. Okay? So this is one of the more sophisticated and essential aspects of doing business analysis. It's not easy to conduct or facilitate a workshop, for example, and understand all of the attitudes that are going on in the room, the dynamics that are going on. I call it reading the room. Knowing when a certain participant is detrimental to progress in this particular conversation, and how to handle that in real time. This is the artistry of doing business analysis. That's why going back to planning stakeholder engagement, analyzing stakeholders is important. And that doesn't mean putting a stakeholder on a couch and doing psychoanalysis. It means just understanding, what they are attempting to bring, why they are attempting to do it in a certain way, whether that's effective, and what you can say to help redirect or emphasize what's going on. Right? So the overall impact of improving collaboration will help build trust, right? Will help make sure that we are more complete, more accurate, will help overcome things like resistance to change and other negative attitudes. So doing collaboration effectively can have some very positive effects. There are different things that we collaborate on, like coming to some conclusion collectively, or, again, reading the room in terms of any kind of an activity. Let's talk about them. If we're having a hard time agreeing on, say, estimated resources or who's involved doing what or whether requirements are in or out or prioritization, then sometimes just going back and doing a little bit of negotiation, using a technique like Moscow, must, should, could, and won't, will help us get over that, help us come to a better conclusion. Sometimes there's trade-offs involved. Sometimes there's delayed review or subsequent follow-up review, which helps put somebody at ease. So anyway, all those things allow us to accept a path forward and continue, as opposed to not agreeing with a path forward and having some cause for dissension. Right? So we're monitoring engagement into the body language that we see, the tone, the nonverbal cues that are available. Things aren't always obvious. Right? Sometimes I have to just pause a conversation and ask, are there any issues that I need to be aware of that are going to help me work through this particular discussion? And ask a question in an open way that will encourage somebody to say, you know what, here's my problem with what's going on. Right? That way you help uncover things like hidden agendas. Okay, but if we can do this again successfully, then we can encourage greater participation, more effective participation. We can do things like have confirming results, right? Sustaining the ongoing interest of people going forward. That's why we manage collaboration. All right, any questions on that knowledge area? What we're going to do now is cover, and this is going to be almost like drinking out of a fire hose. We're going to cover a lot of different techniques. Each time we look at techniques, we're going to associate them with one or another knowledge area. So I just want to go back to this mind map. We've done business analysis, planning and monitoring, and elicitation. We're going to get into as many of these as we can. Life cycle management, requirements life cycle management, strategy analysis, requirements analysis and design definition, and a solution evaluation. And we will cover, again, each of these that are listed in conjunction with that particular knowledge area. Next week, with Laura, she will go through all of the tasks and other things you need to know about each of these knowledge areas. So this part of the webinar is to help you become familiar with those techniques so that when Laura discusses the actual tasks, you have a better feel for what techniques we might use to accomplish those tasks. First one we'll talk about is requirements lifecycle management. In doing lifecycle management, we're going to do things like maintain requirements and trace requirements, etc. So here are some of the techniques that might contribute to that. What is a glossary of terms? That's a technique, creating a glossary. How do we do prioritization? I just mentioned one prioritization technique called Moscow. We'll talk about some more of those. What's this idea behind backlog management? In other words, what is in this list of things to do? And what are the requirements that are to be attended to? How does that apply? How does that relate to item tracking? And another life cycle management technique is what do we do with lessons learned? First, the glossary. It's important to keep track of terms that are specific to a particular domain so that anybody coming across that term knows what it means. There's some domains that have very specialized language, and so having one place to define it gives us all a common reference. I don't have to define it every document that I write. I don't have to define it every time I have a meeting. I have a place where I keep track of these different terms, and they're accessible. I might also want to understand that for this term, here are some other things that you might hear that are actually the same term. They're aliases or synonyms of that term. Okay. The strengths of keeping the glossary, I think, are pretty obvious. That people don't get lost because they don't understand what you're talking about. You do it in one place. Everybody refers to the same list. You make it accessible to everybody. Therefore, it's consistent. And it makes all of our writing that much easier to accomplish. Somebody needs to own it. Right? It might be something that exists in a domain that you refer to, but other than that, then you might own it, or somebody else might own it, and maintain it. And you come across new terms, make sure that it's something that you add. There might be some differences of opinion as to what a term means. So, like anything else, you may need to resolve that so that you can come up with agreeing on a single definition. Right? So that's glossary. Prioritization is an important part of doing requirements management because we need to know what requirements we consider to be higher or lower priority. Doesn't mean that we necessarily rank them 1 to 100 or 1 to 1,000 and do them in a strict order, but we have a good understanding of those that for whatever criteria are more valuable or easier to do or less expensive or more urgent than others. Right? So by setting this idea of priority, we help understand the framework of all requirements. Not all requirements are equal. If we have a lot of people in a room and we try to prioritize a list of requirements, we might get differences of opinion. We might get very wildly differences of opinion. And it's usually because people are looking at it from different perspectives, with different criteria. So one thing we need to do is to understand what all those criteria are, and maybe go through prioritization from different perspectives. Like first, let's look at all the requirements from the point of view of value. Which of these requirements adds more value back to the business? And I might get a very different priority order than if I look at the same set of requirements from the point of view of which ones are easier to do. Where's the low-hanging fruit? Right? Or which ones are more or less costly to implement, have a lot more involved. And so there's something to be learned every time we go through and do prioritization. A simple way to do it is low, medium, high, as long as we understand what that means. I don't want one person's medium to be some other person's high or another person's low. I should have some kind of definition behind it. Rank ordering is another way to do it, as long as it's not too detailed. I can rank order things 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and put them in classes like a lot of number 1s, a lot of number 2s, a lot of number 3s, etc. It might be hard for me to rank order things, what's the difference between 27 and 28 and 29 and 30? So you have to keep track of how detailed that rank ordering is. There's another technique called time boxing or budgeting, which are variations of the same thing. Usually where I have a constraint. In other words, I have only so much time to spend in elapsed time to get something done, or only so many resources or so much effort to expend, right? And therefore some things are going to be in and some things are not going to be in. And so I'll use this idea of time boxing or budgeting to do that. Or maybe I have a way to consider what things I finally can get done. I have differences of opinion, and I actually do some negotiation. Well, if you give up that, can you accept this? Right? Is that an appropriate way to settle the issue? Now, each of these techniques you will read individually in Chapter 10. Right? Collectively, the strength of doing prioritization is that it helps us come up with an overall perspective on what things we're going to handle earlier or later, right? Because we have a common understanding now or we've reached some way that we can accept which things are more important for whichever reason than other things. And we've managed to work through some of the trade-offs perhaps, because there's more often than not more things to do than we have time or resources to do them. All right? And by doing prioritization, it helps us assure that what we do finally get done, does offer the greatest value or is of more significance than what we don't get done or get done in some other phase. Prioritization has issues because of who is involved. Sometimes people have an unwillingness to compromise or non-negotiable demands or just plain old stubbornness, or they're looking at it from one perspective and not regarding other perspectives. Sometimes we're not basing this kind of discussion on facts that might be available, and so understanding significance via some way of exploring metrics or key process indicators, for example, might help us do that. Right? And sometimes it's just a matter of hierarchy or loudest voice or any number of other things which could skew our results. So if we're doing prioritization, we want to pick the kind of technique and execute that technique in such a way that helps avoid some of these issues.
Peter, what exactly are trade-offs mean in this context?
So if I have 5 things I want that you want to get done, right? And Cadona has 5 things that Cadona wants to get done. We're not going to get them all done. So where can we come to some agreement? And if there are 2 things you can give up so that there's something else we can get done on Cadona's list, is that going to be acceptable to each of you? Those are trade-offs.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Backlog management is a way to look at all the things that are in our queue. Think of, waiting in line to get into a movie. That's your backlog, right? And the backlog management, is who's towards the front of that line and who's towards the middle or towards the end of that line. And what do we know about the things that are in the front or the things that are in the middle or the things that are at the end? We think about backlog management in particular with regard to agile techniques, because we ask the product owner to manage the product backlog, to let us know from the product owner's perspective which things are higher in that backlog, higher priority, earlier, most important to get done versus middle or end. Right? And so we do backlog management in order to understand, here are all of the things to be done. Here are the ones that we've addressed. Here are the ones that are next in queue. Here are the ones that I need to explore in more detail. Because in Agile, we don't develop detail requirements about everything. We get more and more detail as things become closer to being to the top of that backlog management list. Right? We don't bother exploring a lot of detail about things that are near the middle or the bottom of that list, because we don't know if those things are even going to survive. Right? We're not ready for those things yet. And then usually in backlog management, there's some periodic review. For example, in a sprint type of methodology for doing Agile, every sprint we look at the backlog again, and we just either affirm that, hey, what was existed before hasn't changed, or maybe something has changed and here's why. And so even within that product backlog, we are doing prioritization. Right? In Agile, we look at relative complexity for completing certain stories. Some stories are more complex, more difficult, require more resources than other stories. That's one way of understanding the backlog. But we also want to understand what's the relative value that some stories give us versus other stories. Right? And so we begin to put things in different releases or different sprints down the road. Another part of doing this prioritization might be doing some form of estimating. Right? So we want to have more detail about those things that are higher on the list, and understand more clearly how much work might be involved or what kind of value might be the result. Right? We have less estimation going on with things lower in the list, because it's just at a higher level. I'm not ready to, again, address that level of detail. Right? So things might change in that backlog in terms of rising up, entering in, we didn't think of before, disappearing, no longer important, falling down in terms of priority. And so it's the product owner's responsibility again to manage that backlog and to let the rest of the sprint team understand what has changed and why. So the strengths of doing backlog management is that it allows us to keep track of the priorities according to the sponsor, according to the product owner, because they own that particular process, not exclusively, not without consideration of anyone else, but they're the accountable party when it comes to the backlog. And it helps us all keep track of the things that are more important, therefore spending our efforts discovering detail about the things that are to be done sooner rather than the things that are to be done later. And so it helps in communication. It could be a little bit cumbersome to manage, and certainly you have to be adjustable to the change. I would say that anybody who starts out using Agile and backlog management will probably take 6 months, a year, maybe even a couple of years before you're really comfortable with this and it works well. It's not something that happens in a snap of a finger. Okay?
So, Peter, the backlog management is not done by BA, is it?
BA might work with a product owner. And
right, but the backlog management specifically, but it cannot be done by the BA because it has different product owners to it.
Well, again, let's talk about a RACI matrix relative to backlog management. It's the product owner who is accountable, who is the decision maker, but may not be the one uncovering some of the issues, right? So we talk about pruning and grooming items in the backlog. BAs can do that. Maybe there's something about a need that's going to involve a process change, right? Well, the BA can help understand what's the current process, the future process, can do a lot of that work, in managing that backlog before that item now comes to the attention of the next sprint and actually gets worked on by the committed team. Right? So there's opportunities for business analysis to support the product owner in doing that pruning and grooming that effectively manages the backlog list without being the decision maker on the backlog list.
Okay.
That practice, by the way, is done different ways by different groups. Right? So there's no one way to do that. That was just my suggestion.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So another technique involves item tracking. Now, I think of items not necessarily as requirements that are managed in a product backlog, but of things like issues, things that need to be resolved, work activities, something that we have to have a meeting to resolve this, or we have to solve a certain problem. And so we do a lot of that with item tracking, right, which is sometimes called issues management, very closely related to item tracking. Or if we have things like test plans, we have different test scenarios, and we do item tracking to track the progress of those particular things. Which ones have been tested, which ones passed, which ones went in for some new work, which ones are going to be retested. Right? So item tracking captures an activity, where that came from, like who was the author, who originated it, who's working on it, who's currently assigned to it, what's its current state or progress. Are there dependencies between different items? Like I need to do this before I can do that, or doing this will help me give information regarding 5 other things. Right? I need to know for different items, if I'm doing test management or test tracking, for example, which ones are defects, which defects are mission critical, which ones are important, which ones I have workarounds, which ones are strictly cosmetic. So there's, depending on what items I'm tracking, I'll have different things I want to capture in my item tracking record. Each item should have some unique identifier. A summary could be as simple as the name I give it or a sentence. I may or may not have some category that it's part of, or a type. This again depends on whether I'm doing troubleshooting or something else of that nature. An owner, is somebody who might be currently working on it, or somebody who is the ultimate decider of whether or not it's been satisfied. Right? There might be some data associated with a particular item. What's the impact if we're doing, again, something like troubleshooting? What's the impact of this trouble? Do we have a priority assigned to this particular issue? Was it resolved? When was it resolved? Did it need to be escalated? If so, to whom? These are all things that, depending on what I'm tracking, I may need to record. How I do that, again, depends on the complexity of my system and my tools. I could do something as easily as put it into SharePoint, which does a great job doing item tracking. Right? Or I might have something more enterprise-wide that requires a more sophisticated type of software to manage. Maybe I'll do something in a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. It's really simple. Right? More often than not, I'll have some type of reporting mechanism that tells me what's my mean time to failure, or my mean time to repair, or things of that nature. How many items were resolved within an hour or within 6 hours? That might be important information for me to help monitor item tracking and see that things are being taken care of, and to look for ways to improve the process behind it. Right? The strengths of item tracking are to see that anything that's been identified is recorded somewhere, so it doesn't just drop off and get ignored or forgotten about. Right? It also helps us prioritize among the different items and to know who's working on what, right? So that things are being addressed or not being addressed, and when they're resolved, what the outcome was. All these kinds of things can contribute to our project. Right? Limitations are that, depending again on the size and complexity, it may take a very sophisticated system to manage. But if that's what we have to do, that's what we have to do. Somebody needs to keep it up to date. Right? Somebody needs to see that items don't just stay on there forever, that either they are worthy of being resolved, or you take them off because they're no longer critical. Right? And the last technique that we were going to, yes.
Before we move on to the next one. So to see the item tracking and backlog management. So item also needs some priority in work count, right?
Okay, so there are some similarities in backlog management and item tracking. We generally think of backlog management as being requirements, things to do. We generally think of item tracking as being other types of things like issues, problems, test results, different things other than requirements. Either one needs some degree of prioritization. Was that your question?
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay, good.
I had a similar question around the WBS, the work breakdown structure, and the item tracking. It sounds like they're very similar. Am I correct in that, or are they different?
Well, a WBS, a work breakdown structure, might track certain deliverables and might track certain or identify certain activities that are getting done to meet a deliverable. That may or may not be appropriate to track with item tracking. You can consider Microsoft Project as a form of item tracking.
Oh,
right?
I see. Yep.
I mean, that's what it's doing. It's tracking certain things that need to get done and the order in which they need to be done and the dependencies and who's, maybe it tracks who's assigned to it, right?
Owner, yeah. Yeah.
Maybe not. So, I mean, again, these are all sometimes related concepts, but we look at them within a particular context to learn something a little bit different about it. So we think of item tracking as with issues list, trouble reports, and error correction. Right? Those are three excellent examples of when we would do item tracking. And if we're doing backlog management, that's a little bit different. That's requirements. We're still tracking the backlog items, right? But it's, you know, we think of that in terms of managing the requirements list as opposed to managing the issues list or the risk or something else.
Peter, would you say something like ticketing system, remedy ticketing system service now would be a item tracking?
Absolutely, sure.
Or what about Microsoft? What's Visual Studio or Test Manager? Would that be one or no?
Sure. I mean, anything that helps you track some type of item, and even in those two examples, you know, those different software applications are geared towards one kind of item versus another kind of item, right? Or different software has different capabilities on what it can do.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. I mean, it's good that you can associate the concepts you're talking about to particular applications and tools to do it, right? Which is not the subject of this webinar, nor, by the way, will the exam ask you something specific to Remedy or specific to SharePoint. Right? It doesn't get involved in particular applications like that. All right, let's talk about. Go ahead.
But the quizzes and the simulation tests, they do have like some of the questions, they reference systems and applications, and the question is around, you know, which technique would you apply? So it would be very helpful to understand the applications and tools for these techniques as we go around, because the quizzes and the questions are around that.
All right, so the quizzes are not the same as the exam, right? Now, the exam may or may not do the same thing. I'm not going to say the exam never will. The exam may refer to something like that, and for somebody who's been a business analyst for a number of years, maybe you're expected to know what Remedy is, right? But you don't have to answer it at the point of being a Remedy user to get the right answer. But you should have a general understanding of some things are there to track issues, some things are there to track requirements, and what I'm trying to accomplish each. I mean, the product owner isn't responsible for, you know, the priority order in Remedy. Right? So, again, if it contributes to your understanding of how these different things work. You know, maybe there's an example that would illustrate that. It might refer to a specific piece of software, but I think that the actual IIBA exam tends not to refer to a particular piece of software for that reason. You know, that it's not a test of your knowledge of remedy. It's a test of your knowledge of troubleshooting.
That's clear, thanks.
Okay. All right. We still have a lot to get through, so I'm going to try to move on. Lessons learned. You probably know this as in the Agile frame of reference as a retrospective. In Waterfall, we do it at the end of a project. In Agile, we do it with each sprint or each iteration. The basic idea is the same, as to look at basically how are things going? Are they working well? Are there things that could be done better? What kind of changes can we make, right, for the next iteration or the next project going forward? And so we're looking for any kind of improvement. We might look for, in the business analysis context, business analysis processes. So in doing the lessons learned, we're going to go back to our business analysis planning and monitoring, how to improve business analysis performance, right? And we're going to come up with, based on this project, here's something we learned. Let's apply that to business analysis in general, and now we can help change some of those practices that we go to, or some of the templates that we use, or, you know, we found a template where before we didn't have a template for a BRD, right? So if having templates is something that's lacking in your organization, maybe addressing that and starting out with some template and see how that works is a place to start. Right? So we do that by doing lessons learned. It's quite often just another facilitated workshop, but with a very particular purpose, right, of looking at business analysis deliverables and business analysis activities. Right? What are we doing? What is the perception? Did we get things done more easily? Did we get them done on time? Did we get them done so that whatever we handed off was useful to whomever it was handed off to? Right? What are the expectations of those activities? Are we meeting those expectations? If we see problems, if we are consistently missing deadlines or consistently underestimating resources, why are we doing that? How can we better do estimating so that we don't lead to missed expectations? The strengths of doing lessons learned is that we're constantly trying to improve. We build it into our process. We make it in such a way that it doesn't resort to the blame game, you know, so that it encourages more people to be more active and to offer more value. Right? We try to base it on what are called tangible metrics, things that I can measure where I can see the level of improvement, but remember that sometimes they might be intangible or subjective kinds of measures. Right? The blame game is a negative outcome. You know, if all we do is get people to finger point at each other, then you're not going to be building morale. You're going to be destroying morale in that process, or inhibiting participation. Right? So how lessons learned are conducted has a lot to do with not only the success of that particular session, but the ongoing success of being able to recommend changes. All right? Let's pick another knowledge area, and then I think we'll see if we have time for a quick break.
I do have a question. This is Alvin.
Say it again?
Yes, Peter, this is Alvin. I have a question.
Yes.
What's the difference between lessons learned and after action review?
Nothing. There are many different names for lessons learned. After action review could be one. Post-mortem is one of my favorites. The patient died. What happened? But, you might have different methodologies built around a different name, but essentially they're all trying to do the same thing.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I want to start this knowledge area. There are lots of techniques here. This is probably the bulk of the techniques that you will be involved in doing business analysis. A lot of these might be either new or much more elaborated versions of things that you already practice. This is the source of a tremendous amount of improving business analysis in this particular knowledge area. All right, so like I said, I'm going to start these. We'll take a break, and then we'll come back to them and hopefully have time to finish up the other knowledge areas as well. Although with only an hour left, that doesn't look very likely at this point. Let's start talking about requirements analysis and design. All right, so again, there are different ways to categorize some of these techniques. Some have to do with documentation, some have to do with modeling. When we talk about modeling, we can refer to the UML, the Unified Modeling Language, which is a standard that's created by the Software Engineering Institute, managed by a group called the OMG, not the OMG on your smartphone, but the used for text messages, but the Object Management Group, right? And so a lot of these techniques have particular nomenclatures, and the ones we want to highlight would be something like an activity diagram. So let's just talk about some of these modeling techniques. Some will be standards and some will not be standards. Right?
Excuse me, Peter.
Yes.
One question. For the UML, will you go into more details like the particular type? So there was like in the case there was like groupings or
I can't hear you with all that background noise. Again, you have to talk very clearly and loudly.
Sorry. So for the UML, is there any where they'll get into particular type of like model?
Yeah, there are several covered in the BABOK. Sequence diagrams, class diagrams. Read each of these techniques. We'll cover some of them here. We'll get into a little bit of just at least helping you recognize one versus another. I'm not going to be able in this particular webinar to give you any kind of expertise in doing any of these particular techniques, but you should know what it is, basically at a high level, what it's used for, why we would select a class diagram, for example, or why we would select an activity diagram. Right? And then going back to the OMG to get the actual standard. By the way, they could be hundreds of pages long. It's not something I recommend for casual reading. All right, let's cover as many of these as we can. So, user stories. We talk about user stories generally when we're speaking with Agile, because the user story is a very brief, what's called textual, written narrative in the perspective, from the perspective of the user who has a need to do something so that they can accomplish some result, right? And so the general format for a user story is that we give it a name and we give it some statement of value. As somebody doing this role, I need some functionality so that I can achieve this end. Right? And we say that the user story is developed as the start of a conversation. In Agile, we would like the owner of that story and the developer to have the further conversation where they then discussed in greater detail maybe other stories that are refinements or acceptance criteria or whatever else the developer needs to know in order to be able to implement that story. Right, so this is an important part of Agile, and the user story is one of the techniques we use to get there. The strengths of having a user story is that it's focused on the user, not only the user's interaction, but the value that the user wants to get. Right? So, as a marketing person, I need to have access to this and that and some other kinds of data so that I can make a decision regarding whatever. Right? That's a high-level user story. I can break that down into many lower stories, more detailed stories. Each one gives me the functionality that I'm looking for, not necessarily the design, and the expectation I can get for what success would look like if I had that functionality. And so it's a way of developing requirements on a very rapid manner. And again, we explore each one at a level of detail later on, rather than write a large user document.
Peter, I have a question.
Yes.
So what is the difference between a high-level user story and a functional level user story? They are still going to be called as user story, right?
Yeah. Well, one I just mentioned, high level, was, marketing person, I need access to information so I can make a decision. Well, I can break that down. I need access to this information in this format, so that I can do something. And again, they just get more and more granular in terms of what we're dealing with. All right. And so each one will have more specific. Each one will have more specific acceptance criteria. Each one will have more specific, given, when, then kind of conditions. And so they become more elaborate in their development of functional, even non-functional requirements.
Right.
Think of.
So we cannot say that a user story is always on a high level or user story is always on a detail level. It can be both.
Correct.
Okay.
In fact, I would prefer to start with high-level stories and then break them down. And if I have my product backlog list, the things that are, in that are probably high-level stories, the ones that are near the top, I'm going to be breaking down into lower-level stories, more detailed stories. Going back to that other question, that's where a business analyst can help groom those stories, right, to understand. And let me jump ahead. Another technique that we can use more often than not in waterfall is writing a use case scenario. Okay? So the use case scenario, on the one hand, does the same thing a user story does, but instead of having a conversation with the developer, the use case scenario in the narrative specifies very detailed, user does, system does, user does, system does. Right? It's all written out. And it'll explore different alternate cases. Like sometimes you have a choice of doing something else. And what happens? And sometimes you get an error condition. What happens? Each of those could be expressed as another granular user story in the agile environment. So at this particular time, I want to do this, and there's a user story. At another time, I want to do something different. There's another user story. Right? And here's something that could be, done incorrectly, and here's what happens. And that's an exception condition. Could be a user story. All right. So what's considered here as a limitation, I would actually consider an advantage. The detail is not available until later. That's true. But there's a reason for that, because we don't need the detail until later. It helps me prioritize and work on the most important things first. It helps me get to the level of detail when it's appropriate to do so.
Got it. Thanks. A non-functional requirement.
A non-functional requirement is an expectation of service, a quality of service. Like, not only do I need to have a response to a query, but I need to have it in 5 milliseconds. Not only do I need to be able to have a user doing this particular function, I need to have 15,000 users doing it at the same time. Okay, so those are non-functional type requirements. And I could have a user story around non-functional requirements. Okay? All right, I'm going to be jumping back and forth here, a lot of different techniques. We mentioned brainstorming earlier as a way of generating ideas without any type of structure or bias or prejudice as to what those ideas might be. And I said that after all those ideas are generated, maybe I can group them according to some common themes. That's what we're talking about in association. And then another variation of that is if I start out with some high-level structure to what I want to explore, that would be mind mapping. Right? So mind mapping starts out with a central idea, but it might also say, some particular aspects, like we're going to explore in this general idea this area, that area, and another area. In other words, it's leading the generation of ideas in a certain direction. It helps us maybe establish the breadth or the scope of what it is we want to look at up front. We're not so much interested in any wild and crazy idea. We're really only interested in ideas that apply to this or that or another aspect of the main idea. And then I can explore each one and generate ideas. So it's a more focused, organized way, structured way of doing brainstorming. You'll find a lot of different techniques for doing mind mapping. Some involve colors and whatever, have fun. There are any number of different ways to do it. The strengths of mind mapping, like brainstorming, it's a good way to generate ideas, a good way of encouraging participation and engagement, and it's also a way, because it has some structure to it, of taking a complex area and breaking it down to something a little bit simpler or more organized. So it can be more effective than just pure brainstorming. At the same time, it could limit my creativity. Right? So the danger of adding structure is that I don't explore other things that might come up that are outside of that structure. So there's the slight difference between brainstorming and mind mapping. All right, mentioned user stories in an agile context, and I contrasted that with use case scenarios in a waterfall context. All right, so the use case scenario, similar to the user story, is to discover how a user interacts with the system. The difference is that the use case scenario is written out in all that detail. That's all a part of the narrative. Right? It goes through and identifies, for this goal, here's who's involved. Here's the preconditions that exist before I start doing something. Here are the steps that I follow, and here's the response I get. Right? Here are some of the alternate things, the choices that I might make in completing my goal. Here are some of the exception conditions that might occur in terms of completing that goal. Each one of these is detailed out and step by step. User does, system does, user does, system does. Any one user's story I can put into my diagram with one oval. All right, so usually I can describe a user story as do something. Think about how you interface with Amazon. There are different things you can do in Amazon. I can browse for a book in Amazon. I can do that in one sitting to achieve one goal. That's one user story. All right? And in that use case scenario, I can develop a whole narrative what I do, what the system does, back and forth until I complete that. All the alternate cases, all of the exception cases, that's the narrative. What we have here is just the diagram. One oval tells me all of that. Do something. Search docs, browse docs, view events, log in. Now, these are examples of use case scenarios that I would put into a diagram. The beauty of the diagram is that it shows what actors can do what use cases in the system. Notice you don't have arrows. I don't do this first and that next and then something else. It's not a process flow. Right? I can do any of these independently of others. At least the ones that are colored in blue.
So does each blue circle is a use case?
Is a use case. Right.
And the actors are the site user and the webmaster.
Correct. Notice that both the site user and the webmaster can upload documents. That means the site user can upload documents. It means that the webmaster can also upload documents. It does not mean that the site user communicates with the webmaster as a part of uploading documents.
And what about the pink circle? What would you classify those?
Those are further elaboration. So there are some things that might be used by multiple use cases. And in fact, I would classify login as an example of that. And so a login is included in browse, is included in view, is included in upload perhaps, right? And I would rather see login as one of those pink colored ovals, and I would have the arrow going from the base case to the login use case, showing that the base case includes login. All right? Now, don't want to argue with this particular diagram and some of the things on it, although I could. This is too much detail. Notice that there are other things I can do in a use case that would be alternate flows. Right? So maybe if I am in an airline reservation system and I'm about to hit the confirm my flight, it asks me, by the way, do you also want to consider renting a car? That would be an extension of booking a flight. I don't have to do it. It's an option. And the arrow would go from, book a car or, reserve a car to book a flight.
So Peter, when we draw up the user stories, there's a predefined format which different organizations use, or we just pull out a Word doc, draw the tables, and relate how the actors behave in different scenarios.
Okay, two different questions. When we are doing the use case diagram, there is a format, there is a nomenclature for that.
Okay.
I see people do it incorrectly a lot, which is a problem. And how you depict an alternate flow or an extended use case, or how you depict an included use case, is sometimes not done properly. But what I just described is how you would depict that. On the other hand, each of these ovals will become its own use case narrative that I write out. There are many templates for that as well. It's not a standard. My particular favorite, I lean towards doing the two columns. Actor does, user does, actor does, user does, back and forth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You have all the steps in order, in sequence. It's very clear. Okay? So again, that's more detail than we have time to go into in this particular webinar. We're going to go through some more techniques. But understand that each oval here in the use case diagram represents what will be an entire narrative in a use case scenario. Together, in one diagram, This can show me what all the users can do in terms of all of the functionality, all the goals that those users can have. And so this is a great way of showing scope from the user perspective of a system.
Okay. Can you please give us an example what exactly the includes and extends?
All right. So I gave you the example of login, which I think is a better example of include. Now, I might have a dozen different use cases where login is another set of steps I go through, but I have to do login in order to complete it.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Okay.
Login doesn't give me any particular value at the end of the day. I don't go home and, my kid asks me, what do I do today? Well, I logged in. Woohoo. Right? Well, that's not a great accomplishment. I logged in order to do something else. Right? So I have to do login before I can do this. I have to do login before I can do that. It's an included use case. It's mandatory. But it has sufficient complexity where when I describe the login process, I want to keep track of that in its own use case.
Mm-hmm.
All right?
Okay.
The same thing might be true of an extended use case. So where I talked about doing a car rental in association with booking a flight, there's sufficient complexity in doing that car rental. I'm going to make it its own use case. So in the use case scenario for booking a flight, I'm going to say at step 7, I decide to explore booking a car, reserving a car. Go to extended use case, reserve a car. Right?
Okay.
And so I will write that in my use case scenario. I'm sorry, I just don't have time to get into too much more detail on that. They are worthy of further exploration. So that use case scenario, the use case description, the narrative part, includes all of these different things. So the name of the use case, the goal, who's involved, what starts that particular use case, what are the preconditions in terms of what does the system know. So if I'm checking out from Amazon, right, the preconditions are that I am an active user, that I have a login, that I have something in a shopping cart. Right? Because I can't check out if there's nothing in a shopping cart. Right? It knows that. I don't have to have a process flow that puts one before the other. Right? And then it shows the flow of events. What do I do? The system does back and forth. Right? And the main flow, or all the main things I do, my success path. And there might be alternate flows, things not as complex as reserving a car, which might also happen in this, and I'll identify that as an alternate flow. There might be errors that occur. I'll identify that as an exception flow. And then after the use case is complete, there are post conditions. What does the system now know different than when I started? Right, so all of that goes into a narrative. And again, you'll find many templates for that. Right, but the use case scenario is good not just at giving me a high-level understanding of requirements. Those are detailed requirements. Right? The developer can take a use case scenario and develop a system for you. I can add other supporting documents. I can refer to business rules. I can have data flow diagrams. I can do all kinds of things to support my use case. Those are requirements. Right? And they are easy to understand even by a business owner who can read through, actor does, system does, and understand what's going on. Right? It does describe the functional behavior. It could also include some non-functional notes. Right? But it is a lot of documentation. So do I know all of that up front? Do I need to document all of that up front? That's the question that you always face between different degrees of waterfall and agile. All right. I promised you a break, but we only have 45 minutes to go. Can we forego the break and just continue on?
Well, I'm okay with that.
Okay, hopefully
Yeah,
that's
that's
okay. If you have to take a break and come back. But I'm going to continue on because I do want to cover as many techniques as I can before we end the session at 1 o'clock. Again, I will stay on after 1 to answer subsequent questions. All right, let's talk about business rules. I mentioned that business rules are the things that manage how a business works. Some of them are considered baked into the system. I can only approve a requisition of this much dollar value or less. Over that requires some other review. There's no choice about that. Those numbers are in the system. Now I can change the business rule at some point, in which case the behavior changes. But whatever that behavior is, it's not up to my discretion. On the other hand, there might be some things that are strictly left to my discretion. They're guidelines. So even though it's recommended, this is the way things work, I can, for whatever reason, violate that. Right, so that's the difference between behavioral rules that can be violated and operational rules that can't. Why do we
That
want
would be company policies, Peter, for example?
Oh, there are a lot of company policies that dictate, those business rules. And policies we sometimes consider to be a little bit higher level, less subject to change. Like their overall policies of, we will be compliant with all of the best HR practices and respecting people, etc. Right? That kind of stays there all the time, but then a particular business rule might come into play that would be changeable. Okay? Strengths of having business rules is that we need to understand them, that they become part of the behavior that the system needs to manage, that they're very important for understanding functionality. By putting all the business rules in one place, they might be referenced by multiple requirements, multiple projects. And so I keep track of them once. I don't have to manage them through every different project that uses them. Again, it takes time and effort to maintain business rules. Just like data, just like even roles and permission matrices, these things are becoming more complex and sophisticated as systems become more integrated in an enterprise. And so managing them independently has become larger emphasis. So we do, we have data stewards who do things like manage new data elements. We have some way of managing business rules independently. All right, let's talk about a permissions matrix. Often this is done on the basis of what is my role, what is my job function. That tells me what things I can do relative to creating, reading, updating, or deleting information, data. I don't like to associate the RACI matrix with what we're talking about here. That's a different thing altogether. Let's just focus on the relationship to what data I have permission to create, read, update, or delete. Obviously, if I were in an ATM and I would love to have permission to change the balance in my account, I can't do that. I can read it, but I can't create it. I can't update it. Right? So it's important to understand what roles have which permissions, and again, you keep those things usually someplace in common across multiple projects. Strengths are that we provide strict guidelines for that, has a lot to do with security, has a whole lot to do with security, right? And that it helps us prevent errors, mistakes, and wrong people doing wrong things. Again, a lot of documentation involved. Another topic, a concept model. I've already spoken about one concept model. I talked about it early yesterday. I said there is something called a business analysis core concept model. Any diagram that I use to help explain something in a way that's visual, I could consider a core concept model. Right? In this situation, I'm looking at different things that are related to other things. And so a high-level class diagram also is a core concept model. So if I have things like students, workshops, courses, participants, trainers, content. These are related in one way or another to something else. The core concept model helps me see that visually. When we talked about the business analysis core concept model, the core concepts were needs, stakeholders, change, strategy, context, and whatever the fifth one was. But, I don't know. Stakeholders have needs, solutions, that's the other one, the sixth one. Solutions are embedded in making change. Change satisfies stakeholders. I can write how one thing is related to another. Right? This is sometimes a really good way to help get a beginning understanding of data. Think about the things that the system needs to manage, the data that's important. How is a course related to a participant? How is it related to a trainer? And we'll see other techniques that help us do more detailed analysis of these things. But I started out at a high level with a core concept model. All right, strengths, again, visual, encourages participation, easy to understand. At a high level is even business friendly. It's not something that's written in a very geeky language. Let's talk about something similar to the glossary that we mentioned earlier, a data dictionary. The difference is that a glossary contains a lot of business terms. The data dictionary contains a lot of data elements, actual data that the system is using in one way or another. Right? And beyond just giving a simple definition of the data element, there are many other things I can include in the data dictionary. I might show how a particular data item has some other thing that we call it, but it's the same thing, and that's an alias. I might show the particular values. This data element is alpha only or alphanumeric. This data element has a range, cannot be less than 1 or more than 100. Right? I can show different formats. If I'm displaying a date, it's going to be, day, month, year. It's the number of digits and what each of those expresses in what order. Right? I might show certain data as being aggregated into larger data elements or disaggregated or parsed into smaller data elements. Right? So there's a lot of things that I can put in my data dictionary to help me understand data. There are a lot of different formats for that. Some people have data dictionaries, some systems don't have data dictionaries. Usually they're advisable because a lot of errors can happen if you don't have them. Strengths are that it gives us, again, one place to define the data elements, to be clear about what that data element means, to know exactly the format that data element needs to follow, what are valid entries, what are not valid entries, etc., for consistency of use. And it does take something to maintain it. Usually a system is better than an individual.
Does this include like the attributes of the data elements, or is that more in terms of
It could. I can also do different kinds of data models, which we are going to get into, which also show us attributes of a data element. All right, so it's likely that each attribute is also a data element. So each attribute can appear in my data dictionary. So let's talk about a class diagram for a minute. And whether you're dealing with an entity relationship diagram, a class diagram, they're not exactly the same, but at a high level, they're very close. They have a slightly different purpose, which I'm not going to go into, but at a high level, it tells me those things that are important, like we just saw in a different diagram. A workshop, a course, a participant, an instructor. These are things that are important. Right? That's a class. So participant is a class. An instance of that class is Mark. Right? That class has different attributes like the name, an ID. Maybe there are other attributes I give to that participant to know how one participant is identified separately from another instance of a participant. That's the purpose that we're trying to accomplish here in data modeling. And we can start with high-level data models that give me a broad sense of where information comes from, and what systems, and how it's used, where information goes to, who are the users and producers of data. I can get more detailed in terms of data flow diagrams. And so we're going to see a few of those here. An example that includes the physical representation of data. And this illustration is not the best example of that, but if data goes to a database, if data goes to a printer as an output device, if data comes from a mobile device as input, I'm talking about the physical representations of data in addition to the logical flow of data. Right? The strengths of doing data modeling are that we understand more about the data, and we understand it clearly and precisely so that we can eliminate ambiguity. Any kind of data modeling requires a different level of expertise on the part of the business analyst who's doing this. Depending on the degree of geekiness, that's my technical word for how much the data model reflects the actual programming language involved, how much you tend towards design. It could be more or less useful to the end user, to the business owner. Data modeling is clearly different from process modeling. Right? Data modeling, by showing how data is related to each other, different pieces of data related, can also show the kinds of transformations that occur to data. It's not a process step. It doesn't tell me who makes those changes or how those changes get made. A process model can do that. So a process model describes work, usually describes activity, things that people do more often than not. Right? And so there are different steps that are undertaken, and they're undertaken in a certain order. Right? Do step 1, then step 2, then step 3. Right? You start here and you end there. Right? Doing a process model is important to understand what are all of the steps that an actor can do or a user can do to complete some degree of work. Now, there are times in that process that maybe work is transferred to some other actor, some other group. And so I have that expressed in another swim lane. And then they do a few steps, and then maybe some output of that comes to a third group or whatever. And so the process model follows the work in a sequence, in a logical sequence of what happens next, what happens next, what happens next. And it shows me who is doing things. The process model is not good for telling me much about the data. I need a data model to do that. Just like the data model is not good about telling me what the process is. I need a process model. All right, so those are two basic distinctions that we need to be very clear about. A process model has one input to an activity and one output from an activity, one direction, one way in, one way out, so that there's no ambiguity about what happened before and what happens next. And there are certain things I can use, like gateways, and there are different nomenclatures I can use that help me illustrate that. Here are 3 examples of 3 different nomenclatures. Flowcharts, by the way, are just generic. It's not a particular standard. Anything you see in Visio or Word using a combination of rectangles and arrows and whatever else, those are considered flowcharts. On the other hand, BPMN is a very specific nomenclature. It's a business process modeling notation that is a standard. It's a very detailed standard. Activity diagrams, on the other hand, are also standards, but they are a very user-friendly standard. That's the main difference there. I encourage you to look into a lot of the different process modeling techniques and nomenclatures that are available. Only use BPMN if you have a development group that wants to see BPMN. Otherwise, there's no reason to get to that level of detail. It's much more involved usually than we need to develop. The activity diagram, on the other hand, will have enough in terms of gateways. In other words, decision paths and merging and forks that do things in parallel and branching and whatever, to show the logical sequence and all the different variations of things that can happen.
VSMs are activity diagrams, or are they considered flow charts or activity diagrams?
BPMN?
VSMs, value stream maps.
Oh, a value stream map it's a little bit different. It should be its own bullet point here. Because a value stream map kind of shows workflow, and it accomplishes something different. It helps us understand things like cycle times. It kind of shows the progression of work, not necessarily by all the different people doing that work, but by what are all the different steps that occur. And this one, takes 2 days, and that one takes 5 hours, another one takes 3 weeks, right? It's a way to understand the overall end-to-end process at a higher level.
Doesn't really suit that slide then, eh?
Well, it should be another bullet point off of this slide. Yeah. So it's not illustrating any of these three. It's something else. The value stream, and it's important to understand all of the differences here. So the value stream map is really good for understanding what are the possible things that are done that provide value, that add value to the process, and what are the things that we do that maybe don't add value to the process. And so if there are things that don't add value, maybe we can eliminate them. Or if there are things that have excessive amounts of time, excessive delay, maybe there's something that can be automated. Or if there are things that have a lot of different handoffs, maybe we can streamline it. Right? So a value stream map is a good way to uncover other things that we might look at for making an improvement in the overall process. From a value stream map, I might go to a activity diagram as a further explanation of detail, or a flow chart, which is just a different nomenclature. Right? So the basic idea here is to understand when I'm dealing with process, use process models. When I'm dealing with data, use data models. When I'm dealing with the user interface, the user interaction with a system, then use user interface models like an activity diagram or just a use case scenario. So in terms of process modeling, it helps me understand different levels, high levels, low levels, what goes on, where there might be some issues. It helps me break down complex processes into more detailed processes, lower levels of focus. They're great for training. They're great for uncovering stakeholders. They can be very valuable. All right? Again, doing a lot of process documentation may not be necessary, so only go to a high level of detail where that becomes a particular concern. Otherwise, you're spending a lot of time and energy that you may not need to. All right, another look back into data flow diagrams again to contrast that difference. Here's an example of a high-level physical model of a data flow diagram. So you see in the rectangles illustrated external entities, and you see in those other shapes that have the 1.0, 2.0 in them, basic transformations that are going on within a system. Notice for a data flow diagram, I could have multiple inputs. In other words, data coming from several different places, different kinds of data coming from different places. Something happens, and then different data being generated. Right? So think of the things that can happen to data. I can aggregate data. In other words, I can take a first name and a last name and put them together into a complete name. Right? Or I can take a complete name and disaggregate it or parse it into a first name or last name. Right? I can do calculations on things. I can change formats of things. These are the kinds of things that happen to data. We talked about them in our data dictionary. Understanding what's going on can be visualized with our data flow diagram. One of the very underutilized tools, which I think can add great value to business analysis. Right? If we step back a minute, we don't know what's going on inside our system. We only look at all the things that are external to our system. We're looking for where data comes from and where data is used. And so we call this a context diagram. Think of it as the sources and sinks, users and producers. Right? So I might have an external entity that produces several kinds of data streams that are used by my system. Or maybe it doesn't produce anything. Maybe it consumes. Maybe it is the recipient of one or more different data streams that are produced by my system. Right? So all of the data in and out of a system is shown with a context diagram. Just like the activity diagram, this is another way to show scope from the perspective of data. All right? So understand how these different diagrams are used. What story are we trying to tell? What conversation are we able to generate? What greater area for improvement, might we discover? Because we're starting at a high level, like something like this, and then maybe working down to a DFD, where we break down what goes on inside the system to understand more clearly what's happening. This is just a different nomenclature, another example of a data flow diagram. You can see some might be more user-friendly than others. I like this where is it? I like this nomenclature a lot. It's kind of easy to follow. Right? Each arrow, by the way, represents not just an individual data element, but I'm going to give it some label. There could be several data elements involved. Right? But it gives me a brief description of that. By the way, the context diagram gives me, if all of these external entities are systems, it gives me a good idea of what are the systems interfaces. What data is being exchanged between the system of record, my system, in the circle, and other systems. Here is a further illustration using that same nomenclature for the DFD, right, where you have external entities, data flows represented by arrows, a data store, that's a physical representation being a database, right, represented by that open-ended rectangle, or whatever you want to call it. Okay. The strengths of doing data modeling are that it helps us discover and forget this word processes because it doesn't tell me about the process. It helps me discover the data, right? What's going on with the data, right? It helps me understand the scope using something like a context diagram. It helps me understand systems interfaces using a system context diagram, right? It helps me understand particular transformations using a data flow diagram, the logical flow and the physical flow of data. All right. Limitations are that I need to have pretty good confidence in my skill level to understand how to use these and what they mean. They're not easy things to adapt to. People more often than not get very confused between the data and the process. We try to do process flows when we're in fact trying to do data flows. So as you learn how to do them, keep that in mind. Do not conflate the process with the data. Data is strictly looking at how data is changing, not step 1, step 2, step 3 in order to accomplish some piece of work. Okay? I'm going to breeze by the state model because this is not as frequently used. I don't know that this is even the best illustration. I would rely on the illustration in Baybach. It shows me that things can go through a different state. So consider applying for a loan or applying to a school. You know, any kind of an application, applying to do CBAP certification, right? Where your application goes through different states. One state it is being submitted. Another state it has been reviewed. Another state it has been rejected or it has been accepted. Another state where it has been assigned to a particular test date, right? And so when you show the logic of how something can be in one and only one state at any point in time, and what changes logically for it to progress from this state to that state, that is a state diagram, sometimes called a state change diagram. A very useful diagram where the conditions surrounding how something changes multiple states is important to depict. Right? So a lot of times business rules can be illustrated with state changes, right? Because business rules show how you're in this or that, or what qualifies, or what the logic is, right? Again, you need to know exactly what you're doing to be able to correctly identify a state change. A sequence diagram, and this one starts to get really geeky. Each of these rectangles depicts an object, and you got to be familiar with object-oriented programming to understand this. An object has a life, right, where it's created, and sometimes where it then ends. That between objects you exchange things like messages, right? And so, in fact, when I write that use case scenario, user does, system does, user does, system does, I could illustrate that with a sequence diagram. Because I'm showing what the user does in terms of the message that's sent to the system, what the system does in terms of the message sent back to the user, or from one object to another object. Right? This is at much greater level of granularity and detail. I would say it's important to recognize a sequence diagram, to have a basic understanding of what its advantages and disadvantages are. You're not expected to draw one. You may need to make some high-level basic interpretation, but I don't think you're going to see this on the exam. Of course, the next time you take the exam, you're going to see it, so don't quote me. Strengths are that it
Peter,
shows...
I have a question.
Yes.
So all these diagrams, activity, sequence diagrams, are they used in Agile as well, or mostly waterfall?
There's no reason why you can't do a diagram in Agile. Now, why not? I mean, sometimes you and I can have a conversation and draw what we're talking about and make it a lot easier to communicate. That's the point of doing any diagram. Right? Mm-hmm. The diagram becomes the requirement because the diagram is a usable representation of need. Right? The diagram can represent a design because it's a usable representation of a solution. That was a great question.
Thanks.
All right. Good. So the strengths again, which one were we talking about? The sequence diagram. It's visual. It helps me understand things like use cases visually. Whereas, reading through all of that, actor does, system does, actor does, system does, may be more difficult to follow. Limitations are I need to be familiar with the nomenclature and not put off by it, so not all business users have any concept of what you're doing. All right, I said that requirements analysis, design definition, knowledge area, and all those techniques are the ones where you want to spend a lot of your study time. Because there could be several questions about different ways of analyzing requirements, and more importantly, you'll talk about next week with Laura requirements architecture, because requirements architecture can be seen as data architecture, process architecture, or user interaction type. Know which models do which things. Lots of questions. So you'll be given some scenario and it'll tell you or ask you which of these models might you use, right? And if it's asking you about a process, a sequence diagram will not be the right one because it doesn't tell you about process. That would be my focus in understanding those particular techniques. Let's get into another knowledge area, strategy analysis.
So just to recap that quickly, Peter, I'm just writing notes down. Requirement analysis and design is the one you said with efforts focused on? Okay.
Yeah. Regardless of ECBA, CCBA, CBAP, CBAP will get much more into requirements analysis design, especially some of the modeling, because you're expected with more experience to be more familiar with some of these models and to know, when to use ones differently. It'll give you a scenario, where you will now understand why you're using this model versus another model. Right, so that should be become a core part of your study.
Thank you.
Strategy analysis also, but this is a little harder sometimes for people to get a grasp on. When Laura talks about this, remember that it's strategy for change. I don't just do that at the beginning. This is something, again, I might revisit, but it's a way of looking at, given a current state of affairs, given things that we would like to see as outcomes, as results, do I have a current capability to do that, or is some change necessary? If some change is necessary, what kind of risk would be involved in doing that? What would be the value of achieving that? And therefore, what kind of a strategy might we follow in order to achieve that change? That's strategy analysis and design definition in a nutshell. All of the requirements analysis gives me the detail behind that. Excuse me. So let's talk about some of the things that help me understand current state versus future state, that understand the motivation for change, that help me justify why a project might be required. And so here are three techniques: SWOT, benchmarking, market analysis. Actually, I have two different ones, so there's actually four techniques, and business model candidates. In addition, some other techniques that we'll get into. If I'm making decisions as to the best project or the best vendor or whatever, I might do decision analysis, financial analysis, develop that into a business case, and risk analysis. Okay? Let's start with SWOT. Many people are familiar with SWOT as being strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Many people misinterpret this as simply being a quadrant matrix, just like we did for the influence map, where you list the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats. And that is not the correct way to think about SWOT analysis. Open those boxes up so that the strengths and the weaknesses, in this case, become rows, and the opportunities and threats become columns. And although I can go through 4 independent brainstorming exercises to develop what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, what are my opportunities, what are my threats, I now want to go through an additional step of saying, how do I use my strengths to achieve opportunities? What can I do with my strengths to help avoid or mitigate some of the threats? Are there anything that I recognize as weaknesses which I need to improve in order to have a better opportunity, to achieve an opportunity? Right? Is there something I have as a weakness that, given a threat, either requires a much more urgent sense of action or maybe tells me I shouldn't be doing this at all, I should avoid it and get out of it? That's where the analysis part of SWOT analysis comes in. Right? So think of strengths and weaknesses as being things that exist today, current state, internal in that sense. Think of opportunities and threats as being external things. They don't exist today. They're future. Things that could occur, not necessarily will occur. Right? And so that if I have a core strength, how can I leverage that strength to achieve an opportunity? That's going to help me come up with a list of action items or strategies or things to do. And I'm going to put that in this upper left quadrant. Right? And I'm going to continue going through all of the other quadrants. That's using SWOT analysis. So you could probably see how this could be a very effective tool for understanding not only the current state, but things that could go on in the future, things that could lead to gaps or actions, things that I might need to take care of.
Sorry, Pete, but what's how can a strength be a threat?
A strength can't be a threat, but a strength can help counteract a threat. Right? So in your environment, what would a strength be? What business are you in? What's the strength of your business?
So it could be going paperless.
Now, going paperless is an action. What's a strength? Are you paperless? I mean, is that a strength?
Sorry, you cut out there. Repeat that, please.
Are you currently paperless, or what's your current strength of your organization?
We have processes that are paperless, yes.
Okay, so you have you've already gone paperless. That's a strength, right?
Yeah.
What is a threat to your particular business? And not every strength will correlate with every threat, but what are some things that could happen in the future that could, in some way, impede the business?
So there is pros and cons to going paperless. The cons would be some of the threats, I would assume.
No, forget the pros and the cons. You've already gone paperless, you told me.
Right.
All right, so you're paperless. What are some other threats to the business that are out there? Do you have different kinds of competitors, disruptors in the marketplace?
Oh, I see. Yeah, it could be, keeping the subcontractors, keeping work in-house versus outsourcing.
Well, that's again an action. What's a threat?
A threat that meeting stakeholder demand in terms of cost per shipment.
Great, right. So how you control your costs and meeting demands is a threat, right? Because there could be increasing competitive pressure, for example, to become low cost. Well, you already have a strength established in going paperless, and so you might be able to lever that paperless strength into some other area to help maybe establish EDI or whatever to avoid that threat.
Okay.
All right. Now, we're kind of stretching here, trying to come up with a quick example on the fly. But you look at something that exists today as a strength, something that could happen in the future as a threat. What action can you take that would take advantage of that strength in order to avoid that threat? Right. Those are the questions that you ask. Does that make sense? Does that help? So this is a great strategy analysis kind of tool, looking at the current state, the future state, things that you can do. Now, you might wind up with lots of different things you can do. Not all the things you can do would be worthwhile. Not all of them will have the same value. Some of them might even conflict with each other. Right? So you're going to go through more analysis before you come up with any kind of a project or whatever. But this could lead to an understanding of things that would be helpful. All right? Let's look at another one, benchmarking and market analysis. When we talk about benchmarking, we're trying to find some standard of performance that exists with some measures that I can associate with that performance, that I can measure my particular activity against. So if I have a certain way of doing order processing someplace in my company, and that's an area of concern to me, maybe there's some other place in my company that also does order processing, but does it in a different way that achieves, much faster or more accurate results. So I'm going to try to benchmark against that other group. Now, I could benchmark against another group, I could benchmark against another industry, I could benchmark against another company, whether they're a competitor or not. I can benchmark against some industry standard. I can benchmark against anything, but the point is I have something to compare what I'm doing to whatever that benchmark is doing. And so benchmarking, you can see, is another way to help understand current state, future needs and requirements, where is the gap, how big is the gap, and could help me provide motivations for some particular change. Market analysis is closely related, but instead of necessarily benchmarking performance, I'm looking at what is the market opportunity. How much of that market opportunity am I currently addressing? How much of that market opportunity might I be able to take away? How much of that market opportunity might I potentially lose? Right? And so I'm looking at market analysis to understand the market. How is the market changing? Right? So what am I doing today? How might that look differently tomorrow? Imagine you operate a fleet of taxi cabs and someday you open the newspaper and you ask the question, what's an Uber? Right? Well, market analysis tells you that people don't want to call up a central dispatcher and wait a half hour and not know if the taxi's coming. They'd rather go to an app and see street by street where that particular driver is. So you do market analysis to understand, again, future state versus current state and potential actions. All right. There are any number of different ways to accomplish benchmarking. Finding some place to actually visit. It's not just knowing the standard, but seeing how things are done, comparing practices, comparing all kinds of things. Same thing with market analysis, knowing what's out there, knowing what your competitors are doing, knowing what you're doing, understanding the current business strategy, maybe how that strategy is going to change. So either of these help me target particular actions that I might want to consider as being motivations for some future activity. All right, I'm only going to touch on this so quickly because it's somewhat new and I can't explain it in just a few words, but the business model canvas looks at a business at these 9 different areas and helps me visualize what my current business looks like. And it also gives me opportunities to think about how it might change. Right? So I'm going to ask you to go into BABOK, even go into a lot of other sources, much more detailed than BABOK. But the business model canvas is a way to visualize what about the business is addressing its current market, what it's using as different resources and functions and partners in order to address that market, how that leads to revenues, how that leads to costs, right? And therefore, Is it a good business model? Is it an adequate business model? Or can the business model be changed and improved in some way? That's the business model canvas. All right. Unfortunately, we are at our designated stop time. I'll take one question.
Yeah, so my question's in terms of benchmarking. I do a lot of work within the metric space, so like key performance indicators, stuff like that. And we recently started doing Agile, and I've had some issues in terms of finding good benchmarking results. For a lot of the metrics, they do have them, but I've come across a lot that other organizations maybe won't release their information due to either scrutiny or they don't want, their competitors knowing how they do it. So how do you kind of overcome that, or is there something else you can do instead?
It's a challenge. I mean, you're correct. Sometimes you can look at related worlds. So maybe a competitor is reluctant to share information, but maybe there's some other company in a different industry that does a similar type of process and be more than happy to share that information with you. Okay? I mentioned research organizations like Gartner. Right? They do this stuff all the time. Another source of information. Right? So you might have multiple places to get similar or related information that can give you the answers that you're looking for.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. With that, I have to bring this particular session to a close, and it's been my pleasure again to be with you yesterday and today. I hope that we've gone through at least enough of the techniques to expose you to a few different knowledge areas. So I'm going to encourage you to go into the workbook and finish looking at the slides for the different knowledge areas and techniques we haven't covered. That gives you an overview. Then you'll be in a good position to listen to what Laura has to say in the next two sessions. To the degree you can, read in BABOK ahead of time in preparation for that as well. Again, that'll help you process what Laura is going to offer in terms of describing those different knowledge areas and all the tasks involved. And the degree to which you can relate a particular technique to a task helps you see that or feel that in a more tangible manner, right? Helps you relate to it as some actual work, right? And therefore adds more insight into how techniques are used, why we do certain tasks, what the outcome of that task is going to be, how we're going to use that outcome as input for something else. So enjoy the next two sessions. That should give you an overview of the content in BABOK. And then you'll be able to work with LN, again, depending on what you have subscribed to. You'll be able to use things like the knowledge bank, the questions, other information about certification process and passing the test. I wish everybody the best success. The success rate, as everyone has said before, is going to be very high for going through the adaptive courses. That doesn't mean you can just attend the webinars and automatically pass. You still have to do work. But we've found that our approach and the instructors we have and all the other supporting materials really lead to a very, very high success rate on the first attempt. Right? Anyway, with that, I will say thank you for letting me be a part of the first two sessions, and I pass you off to Laura in good shape. And I will stay on the line if you want to ask additional questions, but allow me a second just to close this down. Thank you.